They thought it was just another quiet Bible study, a simple gathering of neighbors in the back room of a modest house, a place where prayers rose and verses were read aloud in soft voices. Nothing strange, nothing dangerous. But when the clock hit 8:37 p.m. and Sister Miriam opened her Bible to a passage no one had planned to read, something changed. Her hands began to tremble. Her breathing turned shallow, and before anyone could react, she stood up so fast that the chair crashed. Behind her, the room froze in stunned silence as a scream tore through the house, a sound too raw, too full of terror to belong to prayer, and hidden in the corner, the recording light of a small surveillance camera blinked steadily, catching every second. The living room looked ordinary at first glance, almost painfully so. Beige carpet stretched wall to wall, dulled by years of footsteps. A second-hand sofa slouched against the far wall, its cushion sagging with invisible memories. In the center, folding chairs formed a wide, uneven circle around a battered coffee table on which Bibles, notebooks, and half-empty mugs were scattered with casual neglect. A single overhead light cast a bright, almost sterile glow over the scene, eliminating any soft shadows. A faint hum from the old ceiling fan filled the silence between voices. The place had no pretense of grandeur. It was a room designed for familiarity, comfort, predictability. That was exactly why they met here. The Bible study group had been gathering like this for nearly a year, every Wednesday evening, just as the last light drained from the sky. Neighbors, mostly. Some retired, some single mothers, a few men in crumpled jackets who worked late shifts. They came carrying heavy Bibles tucked under their arms, greeting each other with polite nods and soft smiles. Tonight was no different. They filed in, one by one, shaking off the cold night air, finding their usual places with practiced ease. The tone was set immediately, a quiet sense of duty, not of excitement. The final one to arrive was Sister Miriam. She moved with deliberate steps, her black and white habit brushing lightly against the doorframe as she entered. The habit made her stand out, even here where everyone had come in plain clothes. Some looked up and smiled in welcome. Others merely inclined their heads. She returned their greetings with a tight, muted smile, her hands clasping her Bible with careful reverence. Without a word, she found an empty chair and settled into it, her posture rigid but composed. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows in soft, rhythmic pulses. Inside, Mrs. Duncan, the host, stood to open the evening's gathering with a prayer. The group bowed their heads automatically, a dozen faces tipping downward in unison. The prayer was short, almost mechanical, the words passing through the room without sinking in. No one noticed that Miriam's hands trembled slightly where they rested on her Bible. In the corner of the room, tucked just above the doorframe, a tiny black lens blinked red, the newly installed surveillance camera. After the last break-in, Mrs. Duncan had insisted on it, saying it was for everyone's safety. It captured everything: the stillness, the shuffling of feet, the tired exchanges of pleasantries. No one thought to glance at it. No one remembered it was even there. It simply watched, unblinking, cataloging every motion in its narrow field of vision. The group began to read aloud from Psalms, taking turns around the circle. Their voices were soft, steady, almost hypnotic. It was the kind of scene that, to an outsider, might seem deeply peaceful. But beneath the words, beneath the familiar ritual, a thin current of tension coiled through the room. It was in the way. Sister Miriam kept her Bible closed on her lap instead of opening it. In the way her shoulders hunched a fraction tighter with each verse spoken. In the way her gaze flickered once toward the corner, toward the tiny, blinking eye of the camera, before darting back down. No one noticed, not then. No one heard the slight change in the air. A faint, almost imperceptible tightening, like the moment before a storm breaks. They read on, oblivious. They trusted the circle, the ritual, the familiarity of it all. They believed they were safe. They were wrong. The verses continued to weave their way through the circle, one voice passing to the next, a gentle tide of scripture recitation. But beneath the rhythm of the reading, something in the room began to shift. It was not immediate, nor obvious enough to make anyone stop mid-sentence, but the atmosphere grew thicker, heavier, in a way that made shoulders tighten and glances become fleeting. The kind of change that might first be dismissed as tiredness, or a room grown too warm, but which in truth seeped in from somewhere deeper, somewhere unseen. The camera mounted high in the corner recorded every small fidget, every subtle hesitation as hands tightened on Bibles and eyes began to dart toward the windows, the doors, the walls, without understanding why. Sister Miriam sat unnervingly still. Her Bible remained unopened in her lap, fingers pressed flat against the leather cover as if to keep it closed by force. Her gaze never lifted to meet the others, instead fixed somewhere just beyond them, toward a spot on the far wall where the old paint had begun to peel. When it came her turn to read, she did not move. A pause stretched longer than comfort allowed. Mrs. Duncan cleared her throat, softly encouraging, but Miriam remained unmoving. Eventually, the next person in the circle began reading, awkwardly, pretending not to notice the lapse. In the stagnant air, the whir of the ceiling fan overhead grew louder, its rhythmic clicking starting to mimic the beating of an anxious heart. One of the mugs on the coffee table trembled slightly, unnoticed, as if from a distant vibration. It was so slight, so absurd, that even the camera would later capture it only faintly, a tiny, almost imperceptible shiver across the surface of the stale tea inside. As the passages from Psalms gave way to scattered discussions, the dynamic of the room strained further. The normal chatter, comments about life, quick confessions, small praises, felt strangely hollow, brittle at the edges. Conversations that should have brought comfort left an aftertaste of unease. People smiled too quickly, nodded too much, shifting in their chairs with restless energy. A subtle but growing discomfort pooled in their movements, their glances, their need to fill every second with sound. The children's laughter from the street outside had disappeared. The traffic hum had faded into a vacuum of silence. The world, beyond the walls, seemed to recede, as if the house were being slowly cut off, walled inside an invisible pressure. It was the kind of stillness that left no marks but unsettled every instinct honed for survival. Miriam finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her Bible. The soft crack of leather and thin pages sounded unnaturally loud in the heavy quiet. Her fingers, pale against the dark cloth of her habit, trembled as they turned the pages. She moved without looking, as if guided by something unseen, something predetermined. Her lips pressed tightly together, bloodless and tense. The others noticed, finally. Conversations dwindled, then halted altogether. Heads turned toward her, casual at first, then sharper. They watched as Miriam's eyes scanned the page she had, stopped on, saw her body stiffen, saw the muscles in her neck tighten as if bracing against an unseen force. Her breathing quickened, shallow and fast, her shoulders rising and falling with each tight inhale. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. The feeling in the room sharpened from awkwardness into fear, thin and slicing. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong, terribly wrong, but the mind, clinging desperately to the rituals of normalcy, refused to act. It clung instead to the absurd hope that this was just nerves, fatigue, a bad day. The hidden camera caught everything. The widened eyes, the tight hands, the slow drawing back of chairs as bodies instinctively recoiled without conscious thought. Captured in crisp, dispassionate footage, the moment when something inside the circle began to unravel. And yet no one moved. No one interrupted. They simply sat, paralyzed by the hope that if they remained still enough, quiet enough, whatever was descending on the room would pass them by. It wouldn't. The Bible lay open in Miriam's lap, the thin pages quivering slightly from the faint movement of her hands. The room seemed to contract around her, the air becoming heavier with each breath. Overhead, the ceiling fan clicked in a slow, mocking rhythm, counting down seconds to something none of them could name, but all of them could feel. The others remained frozen in place, eyes darting between each other and Miriam, unsure whether to speak, to intervene, to run. The surveillance camera, silent and unblinking, recorded the tension thickening like smoke. The moment suspended and stretched unnaturally long. Miriam's eyes locked onto a passage deep within the book. Her lips began to move, forming silent words that only she could hear, words that seemed to pull her deeper and deeper into something no one else could see. Her fingers traced the line with a trembling precision, as if the text itself were alive, pulsing under her touch. She did not choose the verse, it had chosen her. On the page, clear and unyielding, the words of Ezekiel stared back at her. "Go in and see the wicked abominations that they are doing there." Something shifted, not in the room, but in her. A crack appeared in her composure, a fissure running deep into the core of her being. She blinked rapidly, her mouth parting slightly as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Her whole body tensed, locked in a silent war against an unseen force that seemed to press down harder with every passing second. The Bible in her lap vibrated, almost imperceptibly, or perhaps it was her hands shaking so violently that the pages whispered against each other. The others could no longer pretend nothing was happening. Their bodies stiffened, their breath caught in their throats. One woman's chair scraped faintly against the carpet as she instinctively pulled back. No one spoke. No one moved closer. Fear was a scent in the air now, bitter and metallic, coating the back of their throats. Miriam's head jerked upward abruptly, her eyes wide and wild. She was staring not at the faces around her, but past them, into a space that only she could perceive. Her pupils were dilated so far that only a thin rim of iris remained, black, pools reflecting a terror too profound for words. In the grainy footage it looked almost surreal, like something slipping out of the world they understood into a darker, older one, where scripture became a weapon and a wound at once. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow bursts. Sweat slicked her forehead, causing strands of hair to stick against her skin under her veil. Her hands clenched into fists, crumpling the fragile pages of the Bible, the thin paper tearing audibly in the tense silence. The crack of splitting parchment sounded louder than a gunshot. Time seemed to slow. Every second stretched unbearably, long as the tension climbed to a pitch so high it became a physical force pressing against their ears, their hearts, their very bones. And then, like a dam bursting, the first sound tore free from Miriam's throat. Not a scream, not a cry for help, but a guttural moan of raw terror, low and animalistic, vibrating with the depth of a fear that bypassed language. The group jerked backward instinctively, chairs scraping in a chaotic symphony of panic. A man near the door stumbled as he tried to rise, knocking over a side table with a crash. A woman gasped audibly, clutching her Bible like a shield against something invisible. Still, Miriam remained rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed, her body trembling with a force that seemed too powerful to be contained by flesh and bone. The surveillance footage captured it all. The moment when the safe, familiar walls of the living room became something else entirely, something alien and menacing. The timestamp in the corner blinked steadily, indifferent to the chaos unfolding beneath its gaze. Miriam's lips moved again, faster now, shaping words that no one could understand. A language older than the one they spoke, or perhaps no language at all. Her hands, crumpled and claw-like, clawed at the pages of the Bible as if trying to tear the verse from existence. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression remained eerily vacant, as if she were no longer present, as if something else had taken her place. The others did not approach. Something primal held them back, a deep certainty that to touch her, would be to invite whatever horror had seized her into themselves. They could only watch, paralyzed, as Miriam's body convulsed once, twice, before she let out a final, shuddering sob and collapsed back into her chair, the Bible slipping from her lap to the floor with a lifeless thud. The silence that followed was absolute. It was not peace, but the suffocating stillness that comes after a scream has been ripped from the world, leaving only its echo behind. And somewhere in that silence, the hidden camera blinked on, recording the birth of a story that none of them would ever dare to tell out loud. For a moment after Miriam collapsed, the room seemed frozen in place, caught between disbelief and dread. No one moved, no one spoke, as if any sudden gesture would snap the fragile boundary holding the terror at bay. Miriam's breathing came in shallow, broken gasps, her body curled into itself on the chair, her hands twitching with residual tremors. The Bible lay sprawled open on the floor, the delicate pages lifting slightly in the faint drafts of air from the ceiling fan above. The group hovered on the edge of reaction, each person trapped between instinct and paralysis, the air so thick it pressed against their skin. Then it began. Without warning, Miriam's body jerked upright as if pulled by invisible strings. Her head snapped back, and from deep within her chest came a sound so raw, so violent, that it did not seem possible it could come from a human throat. The scream ripped through the room, vibrating against the walls, rattling the glass in the windows, a shriek of primal terror that seemed to tear open the very fabric of the ordinary world around them. It was not a cry for help. It was not even pain. It was the purest expression of horror, of something seen or felt that defied explanation. The others recoiled, chairs crashing to the floor, papers scattering in chaotic flurries. Someone stumbled, backward into a lamp, sending it clattering to the carpet in a muted crash that went almost unheard beneath the unending wail. The hidden camera in the corner of the room captured it all, its wide-angle lens recording the spreading panic. The faces twisted in confusion and fear, the desperate glances toward the door, the window, the exits that suddenly seemed so far away. Miriam's hands clawed at her own habit, pulling at the fabric around her neck, her face contorted in a mask of anguish and something else, something closer to recognition. Her scream rose and fell, undulating like a siren caught in an endless cycle, refusing to die down. Her body convulsed violently, the chair beneath her scraping in small jerks across the carpet with each shudder of her frame. It was a display of helplessness so profound that none of the others dared approach. They stood rooted in place, paralyzed not by indecision but by something deeper, the certainty that they were witnessing an eruption of something that had been hidden just beneath the surface of their reality. The air around Miriam shimmered faintly, or at least it appeared to on the grainy surveillance footage, a distortion, like heat rising from asphalt, blurring the lines of her form, making it difficult to tell where her body ended and the dark space beyond her began. The timestamp in the corner of the recording flickered for a moment, a glitch that would later be analyzed over and over again without any technical explanation found. As the scream stretched on, the sound seemed to shift subtly, layering itself with echoes that did not belong in the room, whispers threading through the shriek, half-heard words in languages no one present recognized. The walls seemed to lean inward slightly, or, perhaps, it was just the imagination of those too frightened to trust their senses anymore. Objects in the periphery of vision trembled as if vibrating with some unseen resonance, a silent drumbeat pulsing through the structure of the house itself. Mrs. Duncan, the host, tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing without sound, her hands raised halfway toward Miriam before faltering. One of the men near the door finally broke free from his paralysis and bolted, his footfalls pounding against the hallway floor, a sharp counter-rhythm to the screaming that filled every corner of the house. Others followed, some grabbing coats and bags without thought, others fleeing empty-handed, driven only by the need to escape. And yet, not everyone left. 3 remained, 2 transfixed, 2 horrified, 2 deeply rooted in the moment to flee. They stood in a ragged arc around Miriam, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. They watched as her voice finally broke, shattering into broken sobs that still carried the edge of a scream, her body collapsing once more into the chair as though all strength had been drained from her in an instant. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was thick, unnatural, a vacuum where even the familiar ticking of the clock seemed to have vanished. Miriam sat slumped forward, her fingers twitching feebly against the fabric of her skirt, her head bowed as if in defeat or exhaustion. The Bible at her feet lay open to the same passage, the torn page fluttering faintly. In the static-filled footage, the survivors' faces were unreadable. Not blank, but broken in ways too complex for simple terror to explain. Something had been revealed, something stripped away that could never be repaired. Whatever Miriam had seen, whatever had broken through the thin walls of their safe world, had left a mark far deeper than bruises or scars. One by one, without speaking, the remaining members turned and left the room, leaving Miriam alone, the camera recording her slow, trembling movements as she rocked back and forth, whispering words too soft for the microphone to catch. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose panes of glass with a sound that might have been mistaken for laughter, or for weeping. The timestamp blinked on steadily, recording the seconds, the minutes, the hour in which the ordinary became something else entirely, something none of them would ever fully understand, and none of them would ever dare speak about again. The footage was retrieved the next day, though no one claimed responsibility for reviewing it first. It sat untouched for hours on Mrs. Duncan's kitchen counter, the memory card tucked inside a scratched plastic case as if even the proximity of the object was enough to sour the air in the room. Eventually, curiosity overwhelmed fear. It was late, long after sunset, when the small monitor was pulled from its shelf, cables unwound with shaking hands, and the recording played. At first, it was everything expected. Grainy footage of the gathering, pixelated faces smiling politely, Bibles balanced carefully on knees. The timestamp in the corner blinked its slow, steady rhythm, innocent in its indifference. Voices murmured over verses. Chairs creaked softly. Pages rustled. The camera captured the mundane texture of the meeting. The casual nods, the unconscious fidgeting, the small signs of human boredom and familiarity. But then, as the clock crept toward 8:37 p.m., the atmosphere in the footage began to shift. It was difficult to articulate what changed, harder still to pinpoint the exact moment it happened. The light in the room dimmed not by any mechanical failure, but as if some unseen curtain had been drawn across the natural brightness. The colors flattened, shadows lengthened unnaturally along the floor, and the boundaries of the room seemed to breathe, flexing subtly inward with each second. When Miriam opened her Bible, the footage grew sharper, clearer, almost hyper-real. Her face twisted in confusion and horror, her body rigid with tension. The others shifted uncomfortably around her, caught by the lens in frozen frames of confusion, suspicion, fear. And then, in the instant before Miriam stood up and screamed, something flickered across the screen. It was not a trick of light or a glitch in the recording. It was not static or a trick of compression. It was something else entirely. A brief distortion, as if the air around Miriam's Bible had split, revealing a glimpse of something vast and roiling underneath the fabric of reality. A dark bloom, pulsing outward in a silent wave, bending. The very structure of the room around it. Faces in the footage warped for a single heartbeat, eyes hollowing, mouths stretching into expressions that were never made by human muscles. The timestamp blinked, skipping half a second forward, a gap in time that no one could account for, no matter how many times the footage was reviewed. When Miriam screamed, the distortion intensified. Her voice overloaded the tiny microphone built into the camera, creating a crackling wall of static that seemed almost to carry its own language hidden within the noise. For a moment, shapes appeared at the edges of the frame, shadowy figures that seemed to stand just outside the reach of the room's physical boundaries, flickering and insubstantial but undeniably present. No one had seen them at the time. Only the camera had caught their existence. In the aftermath, when Miriam collapsed into her chair and the others fled, the footage showed something else, something that chilled the blood of anyone brave enough to watch. The Bible on the floor, pages still fluttering, began to darken at the center, as if the words themselves were burning inward from some invisible source. No smoke, no fire, just the slow, inexorable blackening of the text curling inward from the verse Miriam had read aloud. And then, in the silence, when all that remained was Miriam's broken sobs and the flickering timestamp, another sound seeped into the recording. It was faint, nearly lost beneath the low hiss of the microphone, but undeniable. A whispering, layered and dense, words overlapping and folding into each other in a language no human ear could fully grasp. It went on for several minutes, rising and falling like a distant chant, even as Miriam sat motionless in her chair, head bowed and trembling. The room on the screen appeared ordinary once more, except for the subtle way the shadows refused to retreat, clinging to the corners of the space, deepening as the night outside wore on. In the end, Mrs. Duncan powered off the monitor with shaking hands, unplugging it as if doing so could undo what she had seen. The footage was buried deep, in a locked drawer never spoken of again. Those who had been there refused to discuss the event, each carrying the invisible scar of that night in their own silent, fragmented way. But somewhere, in the humming silence of the abandoned living room, the imprint of that night remained. An afterimage burned into the very walls, a memory too deep to erase, waiting, watching, recorded forever in the indifferent eye of the camera. The house stood empty for weeks after that night. The blinds remained drawn, the porch light burned out, the grass in the front yard grew tall and wild. No one from the neighborhood dared to knock on Mrs. Duncan's door. The Bible study group, once a quiet fixture of the street's weekly rhythm, dissolved without ceremony, its members scattering to other churches, other gatherings, or abandoning the ritual altogether. They carried the memory of that night like a hidden wound, a thing too fragile and terrible to be voiced aloud. Some moved away entirely, packing their lives into boxes under the brittle pretense of new beginnings. Others simply disappeared into the silence of their routines, never mentioning why the sound of flipping Bible pages now made their skin crawl. Miriam was taken from the house 2 nights later, when Mrs. Duncan, unable to bear the silence any longer, called for help. 2 men in dark uniforms arrived, speaking in hushed, professional tones, their faces carefully blank. Miriam did not resist. She did not speak. She allowed herself to be led out the door and into the waiting van with the slow, mechanical compliance of someone whose soul had already departed. Her habit was rumpled, stained with dust and dried tears, her hands clutched at nothing, fingers twitching as if still grasping the edges of a book that no longer existed. No one asked where they took her. No one wanted to know. Inside the house, after Miriam was gone, Mrs. Duncan made a half-hearted attempt to clean up. She righted the fallen chairs, gathered the scattered pages of the torn Bible, wiped down the coffee table where teacups had overturned. But the room refused to be put back in order. The air still felt wrong, too dense and still, the way a room feels after the power goes out and the hum of the world vanishes. The hidden camera remained in its place, still blinking its slow, steady light, but no one dared retrieve the footage again. Small things began to happen afterward. The walls cracked in strange, curling patterns near the baseboards, dark lines that looked less like damage and more like writing in a language no one could read. The overhead lights flickered without cause, buzzing faintly even when switched off. The air vents exhaled cold drafts that smelled faintly of burnt paper. Once, when Mrs. Duncan dared to open her Bible in the living room again, the pages turned on their own, fluttering rapidly until they stopped on Ezekiel 8. She slammed the book shut and did not open it again. Rumors spread, as they always do. Some said Miriam had lost her mind from stress. Others whispered about possession, about curses, about forbidden knowledge unlocked by accident. But no one had the courage to investigate further. Fear settled over the block like a mist, seeping into every conversation, every glance toward the darkened windows of the house where it had happened. Eventually, Mrs. Duncan moved away, leaving the house abandoned. It sat untouched, gathering dust and shadows, a dead spot in the middle of an otherwise thriving neighborhood. Children dared each other to approach it but never crossed the threshold. Passers-by would sometimes catch a glimpse of movement through the curtains, a flicker of a figure, a shifting shadow, but when they looked again, there was nothing. Late. At night, when the street was silent and even the wind seemed reluctant to stir, some said you could hear it. A faint, broken sobbing, drifting from the house, punctuated by the rustle of pages turning on their own. Or worse, a low chant, layered and dense in a voice that was not Miriam's and not entirely human. The camera remained operational long after everyone had gone. Its lens, cracked from an unseen impact, still recorded the empty room in its grainy, flickering gaze. If anyone were brave enough to retrieve the final footage, they would find hours of stillness, broken only occasionally by moments when the air seemed to ripple, when shadows moved without cause, when faint, whispering voices bled into the silence. But no one came back for the footage. No one needed to. The house watched. The Bible pages whispered. The verse remained open in a place where no hand had turned it, waiting for the next one foolish enough to enter, to read aloud, to bring the ancient echo back to life. And somewhere, far away from the abandoned house, Sister Miriam sat in a room, with no windows, rocking back and forth, her lips moving endlessly in a prayer that no one could understand, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring into a darkness no light could ever touch.